We now have Mr. Jayanto Chaudhary. Mr. Jayanto Chaudhary requires no introduction, really. He's a prolific writer. He's the Director General of Police in Assam, has been with the IB, and brings with him a huge holistic view of international equations that impact all of us.
At the end of all the discussions today, what do you think? Is China a cause for concern, or is it a thermal that's going to raise all the 4 billion people on the Asian continent to a better standard of living, to a better quality of life? Most of the speakers today mentioned China, one way or the other. Now, yes, one of China's primary objectives is restoration of its national glory. Yes, it is not a status quo power. Yes, it's overwhelmingly big. Its GDP is 5 times that of India. Its defense expenditure is 4 times that of India. By 2025, they want their GDP to be $17 trillion, US dollars. So they're huge, they're big. But President Xi Jinping has repeatedly said that China does not seek hegemony. Yet today, schemes like the BRI or the RCEP will give it unprecedented influence, not only in Asia, but beyond. And unfortunately today there are 2 parallel trends, as the previous speakers have said. The first, you have China-centric. You have, say, you have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China, Russia, the Central Asian countries, and India and Pakistan are also members. The US excluded. And on the other, you have the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which General Bakshi just mentioned, which reflects the concerns that the other Asian powers have about China. These are the two parallel structures that are coming. The second issue I'd like to talk about is what the speakers earlier have mentioned about existing associations. Of all those that exist today, the ASEAN has perhaps been one of the most successful. And as General Bakshi mentioned, partly it's because it comprises small and medium countries, no big giants. India and China are both dialogue partners. They're not members. And within the region, they have 30% of the trade is within the region. That's important for any association to work. So you have this association that, apart from trade, has peace and stability as a primary objective. So perhaps an organization or the ASEAN itself could provide the anchor to any future association. And as our former Prime Minister said, you can choose your friends, you can't choose your neighbors. Our present Prime Minister has said, neighbors first, act east. So that is where our focus is going to be. Now, as for the future, let me share a personal experience. 30 years ago, I walked along the Hatungla Ridge. That was a part of my role in the Intelligence Bureau. Hatungla is in Arunachal Pradesh, just across Thagla, from where the PLA launched its first attacks in October 1962. There were a huge pile of helmets. When the Indian Army re-entered that area in the late 80s, they recovered the bodies of the Indian soldiers who had been killed there a quarter century ago, and they put the helmets in a big pile with a sign. And the sign read, "Never again." Yes, India must never again be in a position where it is vulnerable to any foreign power, where it is weak. But at the same time, 2020 is not 1962. 2025 will not be 62, nor will 2040. The world has changed, the world has moved on, and so have India and China. It's no surprise that a movie like Dangal grossed more in China than in India. Because so far the younger generation is concerned, there's so much more in common that they have through the social media, through the internet, their fashions, their tastes in music, they're also similar. So that's perhaps where the future lies. The young generation, all of us here are, perhaps many of us are post 50, maybe many of us are post 60, but the future lies with the younger generation who will find a convergence. And more than that, look at this recent corona, this what they call the Wuhan virus. The region has to work together in areas like health. We saw what happened in SARS. So these are the areas our distinguished general from Bangladesh had referred to incremental steps. Yes, these are the areas where there's not much, there's no suspicion. We talked about trade, you talk about culture, you talk about academics, you talk about health. These are areas where countries in the region can work together, and it is only then that we can think of a foundation for a new Eastern Union that will improve the lot of all our peoples. I must congratulate both Senators K and the Bengal Chamber of Commerce for thinking of something so ahead of the curve, for thinking of the Eastern Union, which hopefully will become a reality sometime in the future. But for the moment, let us go for the low-hanging fruit. Let us see what can be done easily between the countries in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chaudhary. Mr. Chaudhary's call was, let's get together and work collectively rather than look at confrontation as issues. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the ideal opportunity for any of you who have questions to ask for very eminent personalities, geopolitical personalities. Yes, there's a question to be asked there. Can you give the gentleman, who's the question to, sir?
So my question is to General Bakshi and to other members of the panel. Sir, in your opinion, is the world currently sleepwalking into war, as we did during the First World War? And which alliances do you see India being a part of if we head there? Because we've seen both Russia and China align with Iran, which is also a close friend of India's.
Thank you for your question. I like your choice of words, sleepwalking. I see in the last decade or so, the world leaders, the leaders of the big powers have become more authoritarian. I exclude India in this. And with that, when you have this authoritarian streak coming into the leadership, which is unpredictable, it upsets the established rule of law or international world order. And herein lies the danger. We just saw what happened at Iran. We've just stepped back from the brink of war. So to that extent, I think we are living in a slightly dangerous world, but then there are checks and balances, and thankfully they have worked. Where do I see India? I don't see India still embracing alliances in the foreseeable future. As I had mentioned, it would be a nuanced strategy, a strategy of nuanced autonomy, wherein we will have linkages, we will have engagements, but I don't think we are yet prepared to get into strategic alliances.
Thank you, General. Are there any more questions? There is one more question, I think. And who is it addressed to, sir?
My question is, every time you can say China, China, why? How China is great? Because so many people say China is great, but they can supporting a country like Pakistan in every month of other country. Then how China will be great? Only for economic.
Sorry, we couldn't understand your question. Are you asking what is the greatness of China, or how did China become great? Who would like to answer that? Jayanto, would you like to answer that? General Bakshi.
No, my question is how China will be great. People can say China is great, but they can support a country like Pakistan in every month.
That's
When you live with many countries together, you can't live in isolation. So China is great in many aspects. You see, greatness is not, it is not great just because, or it is bad because it is supporting Pakistan. Okay, so China has got many pluses. It's $10 trillion ahead of us as far as the economy is concerned, right? And they are our neighbors. Yes, we've had a bad experience in '62, but you cannot do without China, right? It's your neighbor. And so is Pakistan. Pakistan is your neighbor. But ideally speaking, you cannot even do without Pakistan, right? So when it comes to living with neighbors, you have to live with everyone. The question is you have to look at the future, how you improve your relationships. You cannot discard, you cannot eliminate anyone, right? Have I answered your question? Thank you.
Could I just add? I'll comment on both these questions. First you. What does a country, why does it act the way it acts? It is pursuing its own interest. Do you understand what is the interest of China? China has certain interests, and it gives paramountcy to its interests. So why it is acting that way is to protect its interest or to further its own interest. And in that, it is to keep India checked. And in that, it helps by, colluding with Pakistan and making sure that India gets, bogged down in this area. So that's why it is doing it. And, he's talking about the sleepwalking into war. I don't think so that the world is, going to allow something like this to happen. In fact, in my magazine on the web, the Indian Defense Review, I put out this as a poll question that I saw this whole thing, the Soleimani being killed and then over a dozen missiles being fired at the bases with no casualties. I thought that was a big drama. And my question says that had the Iranians forgotten to put on the warheads on their ballistic missiles which they have fired into these bases? Because their damage was minimal and there were no casualties. So was it a game where Trump said you do this, but next time you do something, you will have to be taught to behave? In fact, there was another view which was presented that Soleimani was, becoming too powerful for the hierarchy in Iran. And they did not want him to be killed here in Iran because that would have been a very, very suicidal thing for the government itself. So they allowed him to go there and then given a nod that now you can eliminate him. So these are the interscene plots that go on in amongst countries and their relations. So don't discard all these things. And that is why seeing that this war was, none of them were ready for this war, and nobody is going to sleepwalk into war.
That's okay. One last, yeah, yes, sir. Yeah, you can go ahead, sir. Yes.
My question is to General Bakshi. General Bakshi, in your presentation, you alluded to the possibility, I thought, of also a union without the inclusion of China. Now, in some ways, it's a rather, what would I say, a naughty question. In some ways, to look at China as a superpower and positioning itself militarily as well as economically, as the supreme power in this region, the so-called Eastern Union. So there are these underlying currents. China wanting to establish its supremacy. And it's doing so very strategically and very methodically. Right? So, the only other power which can become a superpower is probably India in this region. Not Japan, not any other country, not Australia, but it's probably India, which can emerge as a superpower, although we are probably about, somewhere bottom of the rung compared to China. Now, is there a suggestion in what you said that you look at a bloc, some said no, don't look at it as a bloc, as a trading bloc, etc., but it's a regional effort, initiative to get together. Can even that concept be relevant, looking at it as, looking in terms of India positioning itself, as a counter to China's effort of balancing China from becoming a sort of the only superpower in this region? Should we prepare for that now? Is that a possibility?
At the outset, if I gave an impression that I was looking at the Eastern Union coming out sans China, then I apologize. I did not intend, if I said it, I didn't intend to convey it that way. I cannot envision an area, a region, whether Eastern Union or any other region, without China being omnipotent in its presence. It's going to be there. It's here to stay. That is why India is actually on a cusp of a dilemma. Should we be inclusive of China, is what I alluded to, or should we set our strategy against China? We haven't made up our mind as yet. And we are doing a very fine balancing act, but there is a danger there. The danger is in how will the world order take us seriously, or do they think we are an unreliable aspiring power which can't make up its mind how does it want to tackle China. But then in the sphere of international diplomacy, there are no permanent friends, there are no permanent enemies, and I think the current dispensation, the current way we have going ahead with China is the right approach. We don't need to kowtow to it. We know what we did in Doklam or Dolam, and yet we allowed a face saving out of that after Wuhan. But I think China is here to stay. What I did mention is, when you look at the maritime domain, China has a vulnerability there. It's decades away from becoming a blue water navy. The current show of force of US, force projection capability of the US and its allies is far outstrips China. But China is fast trying to catch up. And in its white paper, it has professed by 2049, it wants to be recognized as a world superpower. Coming on to the last part of your question, India aspiring to be a superpower, I'm reminded of what somebody said in the morning. That would be grandstanding. I don't think the way we are moving at the moment, the way we are structuring ourselves, I don't think we are anywhere near to going onto the path of a superpower. Regional power, a power to be taken note of, yes. And that is why I mentioned, perhaps it would be more pragmatic for India to take the leadership of the middle powers, the middle level powers, perhaps engage more with South Korea, Japan, Australia, and champion their cause as a regional bloc to be counted and not to be lauded over by the two eminent powers, US currently and China in the future.
Thank you, General. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I think we'll need to call it a day because you've taken a lot of time. Thank you, all four of you, for coming here, and I'll now hand you back to the organizers.
Thank you, sirs. May we request ACM Arup Raha and Mr. B.B. Chatterjee to please come to the dais to present tokens of appreciation to the speakers. May we also request Mr. Chatterjee to please present to our speakers. So this would be our valedictory session on thought leadership for the new EU, and for this we have as our thought leader Dr. Rajat M. Nag, who is Distinguished Fellow, National Council of Applied Economic Research, Delhi, Emerging Markets Forum, Washington, and former Managing Director General ADB, Asian Development Bank. And the session would be moderated by Dr. Debashish Chakraborty, Faculty of Economics, co-editor of Foreign Trade Review, Indian Institute for Foreign Trade. I would request Dr. Nag and Dr. Chakraborty to please join us on the dais. I would take a few words to introduce Dr. Chakraborty. He has received his PhD degree from Jawaharlal Nehru University. His rich experience of more than 13 years in teaching and 5 years of experience in policy research. His area of research interest includes trade and world trade issues, environmental sustainability and economic development in India. He has taught several courses like business economics, international economics, WTO and trade policy, trade analytics. And he has conducted several research projects on regional trade agreements, India's trade and investment flows, WTO related commitments and topics relating to Indian economic development for the state and central government, and also for multilateral funding agencies. With this, I would request Dr. Chakraborty to please take forward the session.
Good afternoon to everybody. I will first start by thanking the organizers for thinking of a wonderful and novel topic. To be honest, when I got the invitation first, I was tempted to Google the expression, but being a lazy person, unlike General Bakshi, I didn't Google it. On a serious note, I remember that in 2018, I listened to Dr. Nag in Tokyo, where in a forum discussion, along with many ideas, we toyed with a Asian Union in future, which would be a European Union in spirit in the Asian context. And we considered India would be the natural leader there because it's actually located at the center. There is a trade arrangement in making with GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, SAFTA in South Asia is already there, ASEAN FTA is there, and RCEP was still being negotiated. So we considered India is at the heart. If we take a line, draw from Jordan to Japan or Ankara to Australia, India falls actually at the center. Today now, when I look at Eastern Union, well, the EU in letter, not in spirit, then I thought Dr. Nag is actually the best person to deliver the valedictory address, because given his illustrious career, he actually has been to all the countries in the proposed Eastern Union, looked at their macroeconomic scenario, and in today's context, what all of us who are dealing with trade data know very clearly, India is not going to provide economic leadership in the Eastern Union, which Admiral Chatterjee clearly showed with the trade data. So, in a time when there is a serious macroeconomic challenge, and India in particular is also witnessing growth forecast related issues. So, I am sure all of us are quite eager to hear from Dr. Nag how India would do in general and might provide a leadership in the proposed Eastern Union. So, without standing between the House and Dr. Nag, I invite him to deliver the valedictory address. The floor to you, sir.
Thank you all for staying. It's a tough act to follow when you've got panelists like I had before, and it's even tougher when it's past 5 o'clock. So I'm really grateful to those of you who are here. I would like to share some thoughts on the issue of the new Eastern Union. First of all, I'd like to thank BCCI and Senator K for inviting me, and even more than that, for this thought exercise, which I think is remarkable. And it's remarkable because of the very broad scope that you've panned out. What will come of it, time will tell. But I think it's a good exercise to think through, particularly when I think that well more than a century back, Tagore had the foresight to say, Debe a nibe milabe milibe. I've always used that as a touchstone for me. I worked in regional cooperation for the last 30 odd years, and the whole core of regional cooperation integration comes from this concept of give and take and benefit in the process. When I was preparing for this talk, I remembered that way back in 1991, one of my first meetings on a regional cooperation platform involved the Indochina region, and technically the countries were still at war. And as a matter of fact, Cambodia at that meeting couldn't decide who to send to represent Cambodia. So we had 4 representatives from Cambodia, and we had Vietnam, we had Thailand, we had Myanmar, we had China. And this was done under the auspices of Japan. Japan, as Taga-san would remember, was the main mover of the dialogue. What was remarkable for me was how countries which were technically still at war could talk about cooperation and find areas where they agreed rather than disagreed. And that was the genesis of what became then the greater Mekong sub-region. And it has been very positive economically, trade-wise, but most importantly, the countries have been at peace. So it is in that context that I think what we are talking about here holds promise. It certainly won't be easy. It certainly won't be without problems. Our last panel, I think, very eminently raised some of those issues, but I think it's an idea worth pursuing. And not only because it's going to be an area, almost half the world's population, 44% of the world area, geographical area, but more importantly, the potential. And I'll spend just a few minutes first of giving the context of Asia. I will not be very Indo-centric, but I'd like to make it Asia-centric and then a bit beyond. If you just look back 40 years, Asia was an absolutely different region. More than 1 in 2 Asians were poor, $1.25 a day. By 1990, this had come down to 1 in every 3. The poverty level had come down to 33%. By 2010, it was 1 in 5. And now it's actually less than 1 in 10. So the poverty in Asia, leave aside any other issue, has been a dramatic reduction, mainly fueled, of course, by China and India, which grew at phenomenal economic rates. But even though we still have about 700 million plus poor in Asia, the fact is that in 1 generation, Asia achieved what took some other regions almost 2 or more centuries. Now, the fact remains that there are huge deprivations in Asia, no question about it. 1.7 billion people in Asia still do not have access to sanitation, clean sanitation. About 350 million people do not have access to clean water. Maternal mortality in Asia is still about 20 times that of, say, Norway. But the fact remains that economic growth, coupled with a lot of regional cooperation, has made a big difference. Now, throughout the day, I must say that I have been very, very impressed with how much expertise and diversity of views were presented at this forum, which is exactly as it should be. There were people who were very strongly for something and some against. And I've learned a lot from that. So I thought, instead of my repeating what has been very eloquently presented for and against, I would try to push the envelope a bit and put 4 issues on the table. First of all, because time is running out and I don't want to tax your patience and your courtesy. And also because I think this is, of course, the first meeting, and I again congratulate BCCI and Kearns K for doing this, and we'll have many more of such discussions. The first point that I want to put on the table is, if you talk to macroeconomists like me, we will always be able to tell you how good regional cooperation always is. The macro gains are much larger than the macro losses. Yes, there are some winners, some losers, but gains from trade, gains from investment, gains from incidence of reduction of poverty, etc., all very positive. If that is the case, I shouldn't say that. It is the case. But what I find very surprising is that then why is there a residual skepticism about regional cooperation? And the reason is actually very simple. The benefits of regional cooperation accrue to a large number of people. But the costs of regional cooperation are borne by few. A country benefits from trade overall, but the costs of that trade fall on those people who may lose their jobs because of the trades that takes place. And that is exactly the challenge India in a way is facing in RCEP. I, for one, am a strong supporter of RCEP. I, for one, believe that it is in India's interest, great interest, to do RCEP. But I also understand why there are political compulsions about people in the political sphere, perhaps, saying, but RCEP will cause problems to our farmers, to some of our business, etc. So the costs are borne by a few, but the benefits go to many. And economists like me have always made a heroic assumption that the beneficiaries will compensate the losers, and therefore everything will be fine. But we never work out the mechanism of that compensation. We just assume it away. And therefore, Brexit happens, therefore there is, in spite of and I'm going to leave aside the politics, in spite of the fact that NAFTA has been extremely beneficial for Canada, Mexico, and also the US, there is a lot of feeling of against NAFTA. and against any other regional trade pact. And the reason is there is asymmetry of costs and benefits. And we, those of us who strongly believe in the benefits of regional cooperation, have not thought through how this compensation takes place. Until we recognize that there are losers in a process of regional cooperation, and they have to be compensated, even though the macro benefits are far larger than the macro losses, we will still have this problem. So the asymmetry and the compensation issue, which we haven't touched on today, I think is something that we need to think about. And when you think of something as dramatic as the new EU, there'll be many losers. We shouldn't kid ourselves about it. But I'm convinced that there'll be many gainers, but we have to find a mechanism for this compensation. The second point I want to put on the table, and this came out again in the discussion about should we include China, should we not include China, should we do this with somebody or not. From my own experience, regional cooperation has only worked when it is what is called open regionalism, which means that it is not fortress Asia or fortress something. When you don't exclude somebody, you put out the rules of the game, but then it's inclusive. And therefore, it is a multi-track, multi-speed regional cooperation. If you try to get everybody to work at the same pace, it won't work. EU, in a way, is an exception because it started from a very low base. But anywhere it has worked, ASEAN, for example, it is a multi-track, multi-speed, where various countries have made deals as they went along, at the capacity they could bear. Now, in that context, I notice, I note a very important point made by General Munir and some others, that we already have a whole plethora of regional and sub-regional programs. Alphabet soup, SAFTA, SASEC, SAARC, ASEAN, BIMSTEC, you name it. And I think General Bakshi had put out a slide which sort of had all of those listed out, some of those listed out. And in South Asia in particular, the intra-regional trade is only 4%, less than 5%. Whereas in Southeast Asia and East Asia, the intra-regional trade is 55%. So what are those challenges we have with existing programs which we haven't been able to surmount? Obviously, politics is one of them. But more than that, why do we have thick borders in some places and not in others? So I think an issue that we have to think through as we talk about the new EU has to be, how does intra-regional trade at the sub-regional level happen or not happen? Why is it that South Asia finds it so difficult? I'm leaving aside Pakistan at the moment because of various historic reasons. But even with countries with whom the relationships are much more friendly, even then our internal trade or intra-regional trade is very limited. And why is that? So that will be a third point that I'd like to put on the table. A fourth one which hasn't come out at all today, and I can understand because of the limited time, is the regional public goods and environment. To me, leaving aside everything else we have talked about today, important as they are and critically important as they are, I think we have to start thinking of regional cooperation in the context of environment. Let me give you just one figure which I found always very striking. Some years back, we at the ADB had done a study which looked at the various scenarios about how we react to the climate change. And take the sea level rises as one indicator of the consequences of climate change. In a scenario in which a global temperature rise of 4.4 degrees would happen if nobody did anything, the reason is I won't do anything till you do it, and you don't until I do it, and nobody does anything. What we found that the sea levels would rise by as much as 46 centimeters by the year 2100. 46 centimeters by the year 2100, and you know what? 15 of the top 20 cities and 9 of the top 10 cities which would be actually inundated would be in Asia. Bangkok, Calcutta, Maldives, and Hanoi. You would have several, Indonesia, you will have Jakarta. 9 of the top 10 in the world will be in Asia. So for me, even if you leave everything else aside, just our future and our children's and our grandchildren's future on the environment will be reason enough to talk about some of these issues. I've learned a lot today, and I learned much from the issues about security that the respected panel before me talked about. But I think environmental risks are the greatest security threat of all. And that will need us to think of a framework of regional cooperation. I don't have the answers. Mr. Chatterjee gave me a beautiful carte blanche for which I'm grateful, in which he basically said to me that you are the thought leader. I don't know what that means, but it sounds good. It basically means I can think whatever I want and say whatever I want without being accountable for it. And environmental challenges to me really come almost at the top of that list of the benefits of action in regional cooperation. The fourth is going to be financial. It was alluded to in the morning, but I want to elaborate that a bit. Asia approximately saves about 30% of its GDP on an average, some more, some less. We are a fairly frugal people. And yet, our savings somehow make their way to London or New York and then comes back to our region. So if you are a Thai investor looking to invest in Laos across the border, just across the border, you would actually take your Thai baht savings, intermediated through banks on Wall Street or London and back again. So one major benefit of a regional configuration of the type we're talking about would be financial intermediation. At the moment, our financial sector is not deep. At the moment, our financial sector is mostly bank dominated. Our capital markets are not advanced enough. Our debt markets certainly are not. Long-term bonds are not available, which means, and there are a lot of people from the industry here, which means that infrastructure projects, for example, do not get financed because you have an asset mismatch of maturity. And you also have a currency mismatch because you are saving in, say, rupees, and you want to invest in bahts, and the intermediation is through US dollar, which brings in a currency mismatch. So you have a financial aspect of this whole issue of regional cooperation. And the last is connectivity. Again, it was alluded to in the morning. The huge public goods benefit of regional and inter-regional connectivity, just not land, maritime, air, all of those connectivities are essentially critical not only for regional cooperation, but for internal connectivity as well, internal benefits as well. And what comes to mind is what General Mukherjee this morning very eloquently and passionately talked about was the situation in the Northeast. We cannot talk about Act East, we cannot talk about connecting the India-Myanmar-Thailand trilateral highway without talking about somehow first getting our own Northeast connected within. And that is not just the hardware, but the software. So I want to leave some thoughts with you, and as I said, I'm sure that there will be many more discussions of this nature. We will, of course, have to talk about trade. We will have to talk about the intra-regional rivalry, India, China, obviously. we have to talk about security. But it seems to me that we have to also talk about some of the points that I have raised here. And I hope that there'll be more in-depth discussions as we go forward. My own take on the new Eastern Union obviously is I'm excited. I think this is a great idea, but I would end with a word of caution, very much what General Manzman said earlier. There are enough sub-regional and regional groupings, many of them not working. Let's make them work. RCEP comes to mind as in my opinion, a very, very positive win-win situation. There will be obvious losers, which will have to work out. But the whole aspect of making the gains or taking or consolidating the gains we have is a good starting point. But as always, we must have a long-term vision, and a long-term vision of a new Eastern Union excites me very much, and I'm sure there will be more deliberation on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your speech, sir. It was quite wonderful to listen to you how the countries can really cooperate. I know Dr. Nag has a flight to catch. So what I request, maybe we can have 3 to 4 questions, very focused, pointed ones. Then we can hear Dr. Nag's answer.
Dr. Nag, thank you so much. Very insightful talk. Now, this cooperation, guided by what you said, that can we turn it on its head instead of our CEP working on tariff, the base year, and all those confusions, get into where things are free, the free air movement. You start on climate change of the region, where everyone is equally interested, because then we are talking lives. And then get into the next stage of economics of it, how do you better on other spheres. Any comment on that, sir?
Yes, and I've got 2 minutes to do that because it can go on for long. I'm very glad you raised that, Mr. Chatterjee. I was a part of the negotiations for the Paris climate change. What was striking was that nobody disagreed when I made the presentation and I stopped there. Everybody said, of course, it's very important, of course, The question came, now who is going to pay for it? Now the fact is that most of the climate change that is happening is cumulative effect of activities which happened 100 years, 200 years, 50 years back. A. And B, on a per capita basis, India, China are still fraction of what the US is. China is increasing, but India certainly is. So it's not fair to ask India then to bear the costs of something which was done, say, 100 years back, and also on a per capita basis much less. The trouble is that the countries like India bear the consequences of that. And we started to break down our entire negotiations because the developed countries, and I must say Japan excluded, because Japan was sort of always very understanding and generous. The developed countries said, forget the past, let's talk about the future. China and India, now you pollute so much in absolute terms. And when we said, but on a per capita basis, it's much less. So it is again the same thing, Mr. Chatterjee, that everybody agrees at the macro level. At the micro level, they don't. My feeling is that this is why multi-track, multi-speed. You just keep pushing on every envelope you can. And climate change is one of them. But I agree with you that try to get an agreement on the larger framework first and then go down. But easier said than done.
Dr. Nag, thank you very much for the most enlightening talk. I had basically one observation and one question.
Please.
The observation is that in the morning, in my attempt to recap and set the scene, had talked about environment, which you talked about.
Yes, yes.
So I'm glad that it's been covered. And I think to add to environment, there are also two other thorny issues. One is labor, the movement of labor, laws, etc., etc.
Right.
And the other one is the issue of, which has been, raising its ugly head now and then, which is the issue of state-owned enterprises. I think these two also feature in this.
Right.
My question is that, there seems to be a dichotomy in terms of who moves first. In the morning, we heard Sanjay Baru, and he seemed to say that, look, to some extent I agree with him, that is first business which moves, and sets the pace, for the government then to come in with the policies and so on and so forth to formalize the whole thing. But this is B2B, and he specifically talked about B2B business, which should get this ball to start rolling. And you seem to say in your speech that, or rather in the points that you made, you point out that, the main impediments to this whole initiative seems to be coming from business. These are business issues which are actually, preventing a start to be made. For example, we know RCEP, why India withdrew. And you also talked about issues like this, such issues actually coming in the way of, preventing countries to actually, to result in a coalescence of, interests.
Right.
So there's a dichotomy. Which moves? Is it business first and then drags everything else? Or is it the other way around, where policies are set,
Right.
first foot set, and then that sets the foundation for then the business to build on?
Mr. Lahiri, my sense always has been that the policy framework has to be right first. So in that sense, the role of the government in setting the policy framework is very important. But having said that, and having set that policy framework, I think the government or the state should have no role in that. That's when the business comes in. It would be unfair to expect the business community to fight the policy framework which they don't have any control over. It would be unfair to expect the government, on the other hand, to do what business should do, which is essentially do business. My point was that the sequence has to be policy first and action later. But having said that, in RCEP, I think what has happened is, and I completely associate myself with comments made by Sanjay and some others, that India, and I didn't want to make my comments Indo-centric because I think the whole today we have been more Indo-centric than otherwise would be the case. But I should say that if India is going to be a big player, and it is a big player, it is a very big player, it has to act like a big player. You cannot talk about a dream like Eastern Union, New Eastern Union, and then hide behind protective barriers and say, I won't join RCEP. So I think you can't have it both ways. You're either a big player and you play accordingly, or you say, look, I'm not, I need protection. And I think that is where the dichotomy is. But I agree with you, there's a dichotomy, there's a challenge here.
Okay. I think the last question.
Dr. Nag, thank you for your excellent, insightful talk. There's a consensus that we're heading into choppy economic waters because of long cycles. And do you have any concerns around derivatives and global exposures to derivatives? And how do you see this affecting India and the Asian sort of environment?
First of all, we're headed into choppy waters if you look at the global economic forecast and downturn. But we've been through choppy waters. I mean, economies will always have these choppy waters to negotiate. So I wouldn't be too worried about it. Having said that, I think my point about the financial sector is the more germane one, and derivatives is just a part of it. The financial sector in Asia, in developing Asia, I'm leaving aside obviously Japan and Singapore, Hong Kong, is too bank dominated. The capital markets haven't developed. And so within that, to have derivatives coming in, it's a risk that most investors will not understand, and it will not be consistent with the risk appetite. So my feeling has been, and all my policy dialogue has been on development of the financial sector, which is to expand the capital markets, particularly the long-term bond market, long-term debt market in a broader sense.
So my concern about derivatives was the black swan effect, the house of cards.
Derivatives can be black swans, but if you understand them well, they've served a very important purpose for quite a bit of time. And the trick was to pass on those to somebody else who either had better risk appetite or had less knowledge, or both. So I would sort of say that I'm not against sophistication and innovation in the financial markets, but it has to be consistent with the capacity of the country and the economic state of the country.
So with this, we come to the conclusion of the session. I once again thank Dr. Nag for agreeing to deliver the special valedictory address. Thank you, sir. I request the BCCI team to take the charge.
I would request Mr. B.B. Chatterjee and Brigadier Niladri Shikhar Mukherjee to please come to the dais. I would request Mr. Chatterjee to please present token of appreciation to Dr. Rajat Nag, and I would request Brigadier Mukherjee to please present token of appreciation to Mr. Dr. Chakraborty. And with this, I would request Brigadier Mukherjee to please deliver the concluding remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think all of you are waiting now for the entire thing to wind up. And I noticed that the numbers have diminished, but I will stick to those 5 minutes that have been given to me to express my vote of thanks. But before I do that, I seek your indulgence to deviate from this for slightly 2 to 3 minutes to give you my sense of what has been deliberated upon today. Ladies and gentlemen, before I read from my prepared script, let me just put some things that I think, and these are my views, should be clearly understood. The day we put socialism as part of our constitution, you don't expect a polio-affected child to then become a 100-meter sprinter. The second aspect is democracy and capitalism works for America. Autocracy and now capitalism works for China. Socialism and democracy seems to work for us because we are a nation of 1.2 billion people, 2,000 dialects. I was amazed to learn that even in a state such as Arunachal Pradesh, they have 69 local dialects that are spoken. There are over 200 well-oiled dialects that we speak across the nation, which are as much like a language by itself, and over 20 national languages. Everyone wants to be protected of its identity and this, that, the other. So therefore, it's a very difficult nation to govern. We are many nations amongst this nation called India. And therefore, one thing must be clear. I am neither a pessimist nor an optimist, but I'm a realist. We have chosen for ourselves this socialistic path. Today we bandy about statistics by the dozen. Who, where it came from, nobody knows. How credible is those statistics? We don't know. Mr. Baru made a point that 52% agree that this and we are 0. Yes, somebody must have done a study. But how credible is it? What was asked? So therefore, I'll stick to only saying majority and minority. The majority of our country is impoverished. It is undernourished. It hardly has 2 square meals that it can look forward to in a day. So therefore, suddenly we can't become an economic power. Not in your and my lifetime. Let us be very clear. And since we have chosen as a nation to be a socialistic nation, forget about being an economic giant. Be happy with what you are and make your policies how to bring up this vast starving nation of ours to a certain level of economic independence. To that extent, today's asking for a new economic union then must be thought in that perspective, because this is a new idea which has been now conceptualized in order to give certain order to this entire area where many things will be reviewed, many tariffs will be looked at again, many balance of trade agreements will be again reviewed, and maybe some good might come out of it. It is an idea which may not be instantly implementable or acceptable by you all, but it is something which can be thought about. Also, to quote Rudyard Kipling, east is east and west is west and never the twain shall meet. Socialism is socialism and capitalism and never the twain shall meet. Let me be very candid. Before I get on to the script proper, something which I'd like to say will give you an idea what this nation goes through. The cow belt wants cows to be protected. In this one stroke, you have finished off lakhs and lakhs of jobs and hundreds and thousands of crores of trade. Why you call the cow the mata? That's why Justice Karju once turned around, and I think that went around viral in most of the WhatsApp group that you have. He looked at the audience where he was speaking and he said, हम लोग सब पिछड़े समाज हैं, आप लोग गाय को माता मानता है. Instead of making world-class slaughterhouses where you can have these, a beef market and a trade where thousands worked, you put them all out of jobs and now you're killing them in some ponds that you have created. Nevertheless, gentlemen, such summits are a must because we all tend to review and introspect. And some of you who have stayed back today are the real stakeholders because you are the thinking few who want to give your inputs. I always ask myself that amongst the many eminent economists that we have in our country and the many giant thinkers and Nobel laureates, are the government all fools that they don't take all these sermons and solutions and recommendations that they make in hundreds of summits like this that we hold? But look at the kind of complexities in which they govern. So therefore, it's not an easy task. I'm sure if they are not spending more than 2% on education at the moment, there must be reasons to it. I wish they could spend 20%. Is that possible? You have to balance the whole thing. Let me therefore now come back to the prepared script. Those were some of the thoughts I wanted to share with you. Firstly, on behalf of CNRSK, President, Air Chief Marshal Orup Raha, and on behalf of the Bengal Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Mr. Chatterjee, the President, I wish to firstly place on record our thanks to the Governor and the First Lady for having taken the time off today, although he is not here, to come here and give the inaugural address, to thank Mr. Sanjay Baru to have taken the time off from his engagements and come here on an invite and then give the keynote address. And I thank all the distinguished panelists, speakers, and the diplomatic corps who are here and who have, in their own way, given both pros and cons of this Eastern Union and how would it be implemented? Or is it grandstanding like Mr. Bhowmik said? I wish to also thank the sponsors, because without them and without their support, this kind of a summit sometimes becomes very difficult to hold. I also take this opportunity to thank the media colleagues who are here and who have given us adequate coverage in run-up to the summit. And I'm sure in the days to come, they will cover the event in some good measure. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, you as an audience, those of you who have stayed back and those who had pressing engagements have left the auditorium a little earlier, my deepest thanks on behalf of both the organizations to you all for having patiently heard us and having been such an informative and educative audience. You've been a wonderful audience to that aspect. Let me also take this opportunity of saying a thank you to our service providers and vendors. They are the real people who make such an event possible. They work behind the scenes and they do it flawlessly. Thanks are also due to the management and executives of Westin Hotel who have carried out this event flawlessly. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, before I close, I must make a special mention of our Vice President Industry, Mr. Aniruddha Lahiri, and his team of staff executives from the Bengal Chamber of Commerce and Industry, who worked as a team to make this summit possible by not only conceptualizing the entire architecture of this summit, but thereafter to select the audience in a manner that gives you an even-handed kind of a presentation of both sides of what is being thought about the health of this economic status of our country, and thereafter taking it to its logical conclusion. And like somebody said, that if you might hereafter Google, you might find something that will be worthwhile talking about the Eastern Union. And before I close, let me remind you to collect your spectacles and your pens and your wallets and accessories. I'm sure you won't leave anything behind. Have a very, very wonderful evening, and thank you and goodbye.
I would request the convener, Mr. Aniruddha Lahiri, to please present a memento to Brigadier Mukherjee.
This is not necessary.
Sir.
I had to do it properly.
Thank you, sir. It was your day.
Wow. This is why I asked you to put that. No sentence case, you punish, but not